Okay, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the first edition of Performing Resistance Dialogues on Arts, Migration, Inclusive Cities. This international summer school is in the frame of Atlas of Transitions Biennale 2020. It is promoted by Emilia-Romagna Teatro Fondazione, Department of Sociology and Business Law of the University of Bologna, and Cantieri Meticci. This program, I want to remember, that supports Mediterranean, so donate and support you too. It is a series of talks, lectures, and dialogues featuring international scholars, activists, curators, and artists. So my name is Ilenia Caleo. I am a performer and a researcher, as well as an activist in queer, feminist, and commons struggle. Some practical information. Each talk lasts 1 hour. We will dialogue with our guests for the first 40 minutes, and then we will open to your comments and questions. So please feel free to write your question in the chat, and we will try to collect them and respond as many as possible. Don't hesitate, write. And now let me introduce our guest. It's a real pleasure for me to be in conversation with the feminist writer, Minna Salami. Hi, Minna.
Hi, Ilenia.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here.
Me too. Minna Salami is a Nigerian, Finnish, and Swedish writer and lecturer. She works with words, images, ideas, pop cultures, memories, identities, mythologies, poetry, and social media, creating a very original and powerful imaginaries about Blackness and sexed, queer, and diasporic bodies. In her work, she connects feminism, Black feminism, with contemporary culture from an Africa-centered perspective. She's the founder of a very well-known blog, Miss Afropolitan, created in 2010. And I have here in my hands her books, that is Sensuous Knowledge, a Black Feminist Approach for Everyone, that is just published by Z Books. And in this book, Minna reimagine and rewrite a new lexicon from a Black feminist Africa-centered perspective, starting from this keyword. I read you. Knowledge, liberation, decolonization, identity, Blackness, womanhood, sisterhood, power, and beauty. So these words create a sort of a Black feminist intertwined cartography of the present. I think that we will pass through many of these keywords during the conversation, because Minna rethink these words as conceptual tools to be used in order to understand and at the same time to shape and change reality around us. So I would let Minna speak immediately, opening with the first point. Okay. So, first point, starting from you, Minna, as a feminist practices of politics of locations, how did you arrive to elaborate and reconceptualize the idea of sensuous knowledge? According to the feminist perspective, that there is no opposition between matter and intelligence, sensation and passions and knowledges. How did you work on the concept of corporeal knowledge? And which kind of Black feminist approach and epistemologies have you outlined about the relationship between bodies, senses, emotions, and politics?
Thank you, Ilenia. Thanks for the question. I'm going to respond in a second. I just want to first briefly say thanks to Atlas of Transitions for the invitation to participate and contribute to this wonderful dialogue and these exchanges. Please, everybody who's watching, do donate to, I believe some links have gone out. I think this is a really important cause, especially in our times. And also, Ilenia, that was a really, really wonderful introduction to the work that I'm doing and the endeavors and the intentions of Sensuous Knowledge, my debut book. So to give listeners a little bit more context, I guess, before addressing the specific questions, basically in Sensuous Knowledge, it's a collection of essays about universal concepts like those Ilenia mentioned. So things like identity and power and knowledge and art and feminism and womanhood and Blackness, and looking at these universal concepts through a worldview and a paradigmatic approach that I refer to as sensuous knowledge. And in short, what sensuous knowledge is a kind of amalgamation or a synthesis of emotional intelligence and rational thinking. And the reason that I am adopting this approach, which rightly is a kind of incorporation of the corporeal, so embodiment, and with the intellectual, is because I'm intending and working toward a kind of holistic, integrated feminist empowerment. So something, an empowerment and transformation that involves the entire individual and collective and not just fragments of it. And so in order to approach these universal concepts, which, you know, are topics, so things like power and knowledge, these are concepts that impact everybody's life, and yet so many of us have not had the opportunities or the right, the human right, to actually influence and shape these concepts, despite how much they impact our lives. And so in order to like tie in all of these things that I'm talking about and to bring about sensuous knowledge when looking at these concepts, what I figured the way to approach that is by interweaving, as I've said, emotional intelligence with rational thinking. But what is actually that? How do you do that? And so the way that I approach that is by interweaving things like, as the title of this talk, science and art, but more specifically academic research with Black feminist theory, with African philosophy, but also with a kind of mythopoetic narrative and arts, creativity and imagination. And I contrast this framework, this paradigm that I refer to as sensuous knowledge, with another framework, which is the dominant one, and I call that Europatriarchal knowledge. You know, this framework, which emanates from the Western domination of knowledge production and has, you know, it's referred to by many names. The Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks calls it a white supremacist, militarist patriarchy. And, you know, it's in many circles is just known as Enlightenment thinking. But I specifically call it Europatriarchal knowledge because what my book does is I'm kind of looking at the narrative, the story that has produced this dominant form of epistemology. So it's kind of like the framing story rather than the actual structure of white supremacy or capitalism or patriarchy or militarism. And the contrast between Europatriarchal knowledge and sensuous knowledge is that Europatriarchal knowledge, rather than seeking to integrate and synthesize these different elements that contribute to what we know and the way that we know and why we know things. It instead is a worldview which fragments knowledge. So it separates between rational thought and emotional intelligence. It kind of positions these as always being in contention with each other. It separates and divides between the embodied and the things that can be quantified. In fact, it is a worldview which is obsessed with quantification and measurement and assessment. And why is that? That is because these tools, when used in knowledge production, they aid to a political and socioeconomic structure which is based on hierarchy and domination, and where a small elite are able to profit and exclude other groups. Now, how did I come to this, you asked? I've been writing and speaking about feminism and Pan-Africanism and Black liberation for over a decade. And I've spoken about these themes and related topics in all kinds of varying institutions and platforms. So from grassroots organizations to big corporate conferences, to political institutions, to universities, and in all around the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the US, Europe. And what I found that, you know, the people that I engage with, the knowledge that I engage with, and the narratives that I am privy to be in conversation with, is that there is, especially in our times when there are so many contradictory messages and so much information out there, yet so much confusion, there is a really strong desire and consequent action that is taken toward transformation and political change. And yet there seems to be, there's something that is preventing the actual manifestation of these desires and actions. And of course, there are many things that inform this, but one thing that occurred to me is that we cannot use the old thinking to create new ways of being. And very often that's what we were still doing. So we were using, when we did alter old thinking, we were often looking at kind of altering the structures. But I found it to be very rare that we were looking at altering the actual root of the structures, which is the knowledge production, which is the idea of what, you know, these universal concepts that I've mentioned earlier, among many others, how they are defined. So for instance, if you think about a concept like power, which is one of the chapters in my book, power is something that obviously, you know, in feminist spaces, in Black liberation spaces, it is such a central concept. And yet there are very few reimaginations of the term itself. So while we're trying to reimagine the structures, we're still using the old understanding of what power means. And this is an understanding that has been defined by Europatriarchal knowledge as something which is about dominance, which is about manipulation and control, often using violence. And so long as we are using this understanding of power, we cannot produce the outcome that we're seeking to produce. And so, for instance, in this chapter, what I'm doing, therefore, is applying sensuous knowledge to power, in this case, and using all of these things that I mentioned. So both the rational, the reasoning, the analysis of academic research and theory, but also the poetic and the imaginative. And so I coin a concept called exusions, which kind of comes to embody this nuanced way of, or new way of thinking about power that is rooted in feminism and Black liberation and Pan-Africanism. And I think you also mentioned the kind of methodology of coming to this. So in order to write sensuous knowledge. And generally, for anybody who reads the book, some readers have asked, like, how do you put sensuous knowledge into practice? And I guess by sharing the way that I went about it writing the book, it's basically, sorry, one second. If there's one message that sensuous knowledge is about, that I'm advocating for, it's bringing in the practice of synthesis into both, the personal and the political spaces. And so when I was writing, for instance, a chapter about power, or all of the chapters, I was involving, you could say that sensuous knowledge is a kind of mind, body, and soul approach to knowledge production, so a holistic approach. And so I was meditating, but also looking for information about power or beauty or knowledge or art or whatever topic I was addressing in the natural world, looking at art, doing interviews both with researchers in academia, but also with, for example, with Mama Lawo, which is a priestess of Yoruba spirituality. So just really bringing in an approach that is about synthesizing, interweaving, entangling the different things that inform our lives, because we aren't just, as Euro-patriarchal knowledge would posit, we aren't robotic. We don't just function from one prism. We have multiple layers. So to round up this question, I would say where Euro-patriarchal knowledge is focused on a singular way of knowing when it comes to universal concepts, sensuous knowledge, by contrast, is focused on a multi-layered approach to knowing.
Yes, maybe we can connect to another question that is the second focus, that is about, Minna, the question of Black representation, of the Black, gendered, no-binary, migrant, invisibilized borders from the diaspora. That is a specific condition. And how to escape the heteropatriarchal gaze. In your book, you talk about rituals, about practices of self-care, goddess narratives. As you say, and it is in the very beginning of the book, Blackness is not an alternative. That is to say, that is not a question of deconstructing something of opposite, but of creating otherwise. You say there is nothing of new here. It seems new only in Euro-patriarchal perspective. And this is, for me, this is a very crucial point in order to decolonize and decentralize cultural representations from Eurocentrism. Would you like to go deeper in the issue of representations and bodies?
Yeah, so when I say Blackness is not an alternative, what I mean is that, for me to address a concept like identity or womanhood, because it's quite often that when a Black woman writes about such a concept or thinks about such an idea, it is positioned as something that is new or alternative, because of course the norm is the Euro-patriarchal view. But what I'm arguing is that, it is not new or alternative to me or to other Black women who are writing and thinking about these things. This is the Black perspective, so to speak, is the only perspective that I know as far as race is concerned. And the female perspective is the angle that I embody as far as gender is concerned. But it's important to emphasize that the point in sensuous knowledge is not to fight and battle and argue with the Euro-patriarchal view, which also, it's important to say, is not synonymous with white men. It's a worldview. Europatriarchal knowledge is a worldview. And so my intention is not to fight with this worldview, because what that does is it centers it. And rather what I am seeking to do, so in the book I use the metaphor of a mountain. And so just briefly, if you imagine that that there's a mountain, and for millennia, people have seen this mountain from one angle, so from the left, let's say, and they've told a story about this mountain, and it's a story that it's very dry, it's very arid. There's just a specific type of shrubs and maybe some cacti or some kind of land animals. And so this is the story about the mountain for millennia. And let's then say that all this time, on the other side, on the right side of the mountain, there's a huge population. And what they see is something completely different. They see a different mountain. To them, it is a lush mountain where there's rainfall and fogginess all the time. And there's, all kinds of birds and plants and trees and this, that, and the other. And so if this group were to tell their story about the mountain, they are not, and let's say that the mountain is these universal concepts, the political, the social, and the embodied kinds of concepts that we're discussing. What this group is doing is enriching the knowledge about the mountain, rather than screaming over, to the other side at the first group who have shaped the story. And if they were to do that, if they were to be screaming and say, no, you got it wrong, it's not like we have this tree and we have this bird, what does that end up doing but centering the person who got it wrong? So what is very important here is that this is about enriching knowledge production. And in that process, of course, there are things that the first group of people who were telling the story about the mountain might have got right. There are things that they might have actually produced, very beautifully. So it's absolutely also acknowledging that is possible. Now, while this is all, about is kind of using a fable and a metaphor, there is, of course, a strong political element to this enriching. It's enriching knowledge when it has been misconstrued and diminished for so long in ways that has produced so much political, social, and spiritual suffering, is also a simultaneous protest, you could say. It is a critique of a kind of singular methodology of knowledge production. It is also you spoke about self-care, and it is, in that regard, it is also something that the Black feminist scholar Audre Lorde is famous for kind of coining this idea of self-care as something political. And if we use this example, we can really see why there is such a political charge here. Because if you have seen the mountain in a specific way for so long, but everything around you, your education, your family, your political institutions, told you that that you were crazy for seeing these things, or didn't allow you to voice them, then what you develop is what the author W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. He said this already in 1902 or 1903, and it's sadly still a very relevant concept. And I would argue that in the case of Black women, we probably even have like a triple consciousness. And so what double consciousness is basically that you see the world through your own eyes. You're aware of the experiences, how concepts are shaped due to your race. In the case of double consciousness, with triple consciousness, it would be your race and gender. And then you're also aware of how the dominant narrative constructs these ideas. And this means that you constantly live with this sense of it's like a misalignment, because what you see and what is told are so different. And so this is where the self-care and the sense of enriching knowledge and of sensuous knowledge and of voicing what we see and placing, three very central things for sensuous knowledge in the book is that it is Africa-centered, it is woman-centered, and it is rooted in Black feminist theory. Because you have to place yourself as subject when you're looking at these concepts, because in that process there's both this kind of political protest, but also a sense of healing. And to give you some really like concrete examples of this, in our contemporary discourses, if you think about Black Lives Matter happening right now, and the kinds of the narrative that is being told, and there are several, obviously, but one that is very interesting to me and I've been thinking about is how, so much of the relationship between white people and Black people is being framed by the relationship between white men and Black men. And there's a very specific type of relationship that exists between white women and Black women, and that isn't the dominant narrative of Black Lives Matter. Now, this relationship it's both more contentious in many ways, but it also in those spaces where it glues together, where it is about healing, it is more successful than the relationships between Black men and white men. I'm generalizing, obviously, but when you look, there was a story actually in today's Guardian about the organization Women Deliver, which is a huge, feminist organization. Feminist, I might want to add quotation marks there because it isn't looking at all women's lives. And it's their CEO has stepped down because of accusations of racism. But these aren't the kinds of stories that frame the conversation about Black Lives Matter. So what happens here is that for Black women, there's, we're feeling a sense of, there's a discord, there's a kind of dissociation, because as much as we obviously are involved and 100% are supportive of Black Lives Matter, the vast majority of us anyway, there is a sense that, it's being framed in this patriarchal way. So these are the kinds of things. This is the kind of double consciousness. And what is interesting is that when we look at double consciousness, we think of it first and foremost from the prism of Black people, obviously, because that's how the phrase was coined. But actually, what is interesting as well is how much knowledge and how misinformed white people are in a Euro-patriarchal knowledge system. So another story that has been in the news today is the British Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab, who thought that, taking the knee, which is a gesture of the Black Lives Matter protests, is something that came out of, what's the name of this series that I haven't watched, Game of Thrones. And so, this is knowledge that for Black people, and I also believe that for the majority of white people anyway, those who are conscious and aware of these issues, know that it's like a gesture of protest. You might not know that it specifically was started by Colin Kaepernick because he didn't want to sing the anthem standing, and so he took the knee. But my point is that this is a crucial piece of information in Black lives, and yet somebody of such political influence doesn't even know the source of it before speaking on it. And this is ignorance, but it is, your patriarchal knowledge frames it as within this superiority narrative, and misses that actually you are miseducated and you're misinformed when you don't have this kind of information. So yeah.
Very interesting. What are you saying? And just for going on, I would like something about identity more and more, because you Minna, make a very original and powerful use of the concept of identity and history too, as a space of possibility, the possibility of rewriting, reinvention, recreating. Identity in your vision is not a static and predetermined field. And I am especially referring to your works on Yoruba mythology, for example, and to the mixture of genealogies, cosmologies, and contemporary culture that you continuously create in your work. And I would like to connect this work to the point 5 of the Afropolitan Manifesto, when you say that Afropolitanism is anachronistic. So another idea of temporality, divergent from the linear one of modernity and progress, which is, I quote, simultaneously historic, present, and futuristic. It seems to be, to me, a very radical political point about the time, the temporality, because it escaped the risk of to desiring a sort of authentic past in a conservative perspective. And your proposal about identity seems to me all affirmative and transformative, centered on active practices of rewriting, invention, imagination, also of the heritage. I can call it an exercise in political imagination in contemporary world. Could you tell us more about that in your perspective, which is the relationship between memory, identity, and fiction, and what is the role of the imagination and of the art too, if it exists, in this process? How do, as you write in your book, stories transforms into matter?
Thank you, Ilenia. Your questions are amazing. And yes, obviously, I think that art is, and imagination, central as they are to sensuous knowledge at large, are also extremely and especially important when it comes to questions about identity and collective memory. You see, we talk about collective memory, and we don't really question, and we sort of focus more on what memory is in this phrase, like what are we speaking about? Are we talking about education or wars and pogroms, etc.? But actually, what is collective? Who is the collective when we speak about collective memory? Because when it comes to identity, what I argue is that there's been a kind of theft of normative identity. So due to the history of how Europatriarchal knowledge has aided to the history of colonization and enslavement of people around the world, and this long trajectory of positioning the ideas, the attitudes, the structures, the work of elite white men into the project of structuring society. What it has ultimately led to is where we are now, which is a world in which the normative identity is that of the white male. This does not mean that, a white male should want to strip off his skin or his maleness. Of course not. But it's just how it functions. So for instance, when we look at any of our sort of identities, professions, roles that people play in society. So if we say a scientist or an artist, seeing that those are the framing topics of our discussion today, when we say a scientist, we mean a white male scientist. in popular discourse, everybody else is kind of hyphenated. So we would say, you know, an Asian scientist, a woman artist, a Black writer. And this is what I mean has happened, and that I define as the normative identity theft. The issue, I mean, that in itself is obviously a big issue. The issue because if you remember, we're looking at this from the Africa-centered, woman-centered, Black-centered perspective. The issue for us is that we become we are kind of in a crime scene now, because if a theft of normative identity has occurred, we are having to prove and you know, allege and show how this is a crime scene. And so our identities become amalgamated and synonymous with struggle and with contention. And this is also a problem, because that means that we can't really focus on you know, the human rights to have joy and to thrive and to be creative and imaginative, because we're constantly in a mode of battle, if you like. And so identity is a concept that is especially important to grapple with in our times, because it is, you know, if you think about many of the political movements of just a few decades back, civil rights, the second wave feminist movement, and even on the right, you know, where you have the kind of fascist movements and all of that, they were ideological. Whereas in our times, political movements are so much connected precisely to identity. So Black Lives Matter is obviously very much about identity, as is Me Too. And again, you have, you know, on the right, the alt-right movement, libertarianism, like all our political movements are still connected to identity. And so there is a need to bring in the imaginative and to really sort of, what I suggest in the book is for us to view identity as a compass. So, you know, rather than something that we kind of rigidly hold on to, identity as a compass means that we take pride and we embrace and we are absolutely aware of the many intersectional ways that our identities are politicized, but we kind of have a looser approach to them. And then we can also analyze the histories of colonization and slavery, because it's also important to understand that the normative identity theft occurs in both, it is the occupation of both physical terrain, but also psychological terrain. And these things work in tandem. It is also, you know, there's so many omissions when we speak about this. So for one, when we think about the murder of so many millions of Black lives, we're often looking at the situation in the diaspora, you know, and the transatlantic slave trade, obviously starting from there, but also, you know, colonization was a murderous event. In fact, I think, you know, more lives were lost to colonization than to the transatlantic slave trade. There were wars fought in, you know, what is today South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Algeria, as well as in Southeast Asia, in Sri Lanka. Like, so many wars were fought in order to colonize and occupy these territories. And that also tells you that there was a lot of resistance. So these are also stories that aren't really out there in the popular and contemporary narrative, and nor is the knowledge and the realization that the same process of physical and psychological occupation of territory is what happened and what has historically happened to women by men. So you have the same thing of monopolizing power through occupation of physical territory. In women's case, this is often the body, you know, so using practices, witch hunting, female genital mutilation, breast ironing, foot binding, just general violence and sexual abuse, pedophilia, rape. All of these things are a form of colonialism, colonial occupation of the female body. And then once that has been used to monopolize power, you're able to also shape the narrative in a way that others women through sexist advertising or conventional and traditional ideas about motherhood, and the list is endless. But basically, this is the kind of strategy that goes into what ultimately becomes the normative identity theft, and why we position whiteness and maleness and the long list of other sort of privileged embodiments of ableism, of class, and so on, into what we deem to be the norm.
Thank you, Minna. Maybe we can pick up some questions from our chat.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Just one. Yeah, this one. I don't know if. So it's from Angela Shavilla. What is for you the political role of the beauty in terms of anti-racial struggle and decolonization? You have said something, but maybe you can tell us more about beauty as political concept or political practices.
Hi, Angela. Thank you for the question. I think that beauty is a really significant concept to look at within this discussion, because beauty is something that, for one, has been defined specifically in very particular ways by Europatriarchal knowledge. So going all the way back to constructions about Eve in the Bible, and how her appearance was defined by Europatriarchs, you could say, over the ages, in a way that very much privileged whiteness, but also that devalued femininity, objectified femininity. And in our times, we see that beauty is very much connected to capitalism. There's been a commodification that is connected to the objectification of women. And the first thing to say here is that, the idea that beauty in itself should be connected to women is part of the Europatriarchal knowledge narrative, because there's so much political meaning in beauty in a way that there isn't in the term handsome, for example, which is how we describe men. So men get to inhabit this, these labels that don't have a particular political weight that they then have to grapple with day in, day out, and that, de facto influences their lives on this planet. And then following this politicized definition of beauty, women are encouraged from a very early age, in fact, from the day they were born pretty much, to expend capital on achieving this Europatriarchal idea of beauty. And by capital, I don't only mean money, but social capital, energy, ideas, time, confidence, all of these things. And the second thing is that this all ties into, this is so strategic and smart on behalf of Europatriarchal knowledge, because beauty is important to women. It is important to everyone, but there's something in how womanhood is constructed that makes us, when you look at women historically in leadership, in arts, in social institutions, within the family, we are prone to catering to the aesthetic. And so, of course, when you realize, if you want to oppress a group, take something that is clearly of importance to them and politicize it, commercialize it, turn it into something that actually works against them. So what I argue in my book concerning beauty is that, you know, this is really a concept that we need to take ownership of. We need to reimagine using sensuous knowledge. And yeah.
So another question from the chat. It's from Martina Vedeschi-Bucci. Okay. Since Euro-patriarchal violence is in some way interwoven with colonial violence, what can we do to decolonize our mind? And you have talked about that before. Maybe you can say us more. And I want to connect to another issue that you address in your book about institutions, cultural institutions or artistic institution, or institution of I don't know what, but new and no existing institution, because there's an issue that also in the past meetings and dialogues came out, because you about decolonization, you write that we need, I quote, cultural monuments, museum and memorial that weave the legacy of slavery and colonialism. You know, we need, you say, space for mourn, for pain, and also for memories. So maybe we can take together this issue between so decolonize and the role of the institutions. If there
Great,
is.
yeah. Thanks, Martina, and thanks, Ilenia, for speaking a little bit. So I got to just take a break. I feel like I've been talking so much. So that's another fantastic question. I really appreciate it, because it's so important. It's so timely, the question of decolonization, that is. And we are approaching it in ways that are problematic. There's, for example, a really strong emphasis on the political side of decolonization. There's a strong emphasis on language, for example. So, you know, the central argument in decolonization studies for many decades was, when it came to Africa, for example, was this question of indigenous language and needing to, you know, revert back to ethnic languages, which is obviously a fantastic and important part of the struggle. But I think, you know, in terms of decolonizing the mind in a way that, so ultimately what decolonizing the mind is developing and cultivating a mind that cannot be manipulated. It's really important to understand that. Cultivating a mind that cannot be manipulated is obviously an endeavor and a task that involves so many different things and practices and knowledge systems, which is again why sensuous knowledge is so vital, because decolonization is really something that has to be approached in a holistic way for it to have a lasting effect. And so one of the things, I mean, when I said that we're centralizing a kind of jargoned, heavily academic approach, you could say, to decolonization, which I think is concerning, because decolonization is something that has to be for the masses. You know, we will not achieve decolonized societies unless decolonization is framed by a language that everyone can be informed by. And so, you know, this goes to the point about having spaces for memory and the poetic, as you were saying, Ilenia, that, you know, I think that with decolonization, we attempt it at the moment. We speak of it. It's almost like we think that the D means something that you can detach or remove, you know, in the way that you might remove an old piece of furniture and throw it away. And that creates this like almost a paranoia, because you sort of think, oh, I'm failing at decolonization because I still have this male supremacist voice or this white supremacist voice that every so often pops up in my head. But that isn't what decolonization is. You can't swallow a pill, a decolonization pill, and wake up the next day free of it. Rather, it is this slow process. It's kind of it's like a hybrid. It's bringing together knowledge from Europatriarchal knowledge, from different indigenous cultures. It's really slowly evaluating what is true, what is healing, what is positive, and from a very critical point of view, then challenging that which is oppressive and false, with the ultimate goal being that you as an individual and you as part of the collective, that we all stay focused on that. The ultimate goal is that we need to thrive. We need to attain some kind of grounding and ease with being in this world. This is what it means to have human rights. Ultimately, it means that you can exist in a satisfying way, with challenges, but in a satisfying way. And what colonization has done is that it makes us it makes that impossible for groups that are not seen as the norm. It makes it very, very challenging. It's a huge labor, a huge political and spiritual labor to do away with the oppressive thinking. So decolonization is really about finding a way to have a mind that can't be manipulated and that is grounded and centered.
Thank you, Minna. So there is a comment from Bakare Babatunde from Nigeria that I would like to read you. Bakare writes, kindly explain to the analogy you made about Yoruba women at the beginning of this lecture better. I am a Yoruba and I'm from Nigeria. And maybe we can connect these comments to another, maybe the last one, question from Lorenza Ippolito. Lorenza writes, I work with a group of queer women, part of a poetry group. We talk a lot about kinship and how to find different ways of being together that escape patriarchal family structures. Can you talk to the center the concept of family from Western conceptions of family and how the project family has colonized ways of being together?
I'm trying to just find that question so I can. Okay, there we see.
Lorenzo Ippolito.
Okay, thank you, Bakari and Lorenza. So the analogy about Yoruba women, I can't quite remember what I said, but definitely the philosophies of Yoruba women and various groups of African people and indigenous people around the world inform sensuous knowledge. To give a quick example, there is the philosopher Sophie Bosede-Oluwole, and she is a huge inspiration for me generally, but also in the book. And her approach is especially important because Professor Oluwole always centered herself. So herself as a feminist, as a woman, and as a person of Yoruba and Nigerian heritage and African heritage. And so she really shows how that can work in theory and in the philosophical space. Somebody who you could say practices the kinds of philosophies that Professor Oluwole wrote about is the Yoruba activist, businesswoman, feminist activist Nike Ogundaike, who runs the largest art center in West Africa. This is she has the Nike Art Gallery in Lagos, and she uses art in a way to do feminist activism, to do Pan-Africanism, to probe into the kinds of questions that we've been discussing. And one question that she for instance, has spoken about a lot is this notion of family. And I want to say that, it's not about, I don't want to romanticize Yoruba notions of family or any African or any global notions of family, because patriarchy is a global order. So when I say Euro-patriarchal knowledge, that's looking at the dominant global system, but there is an equivalent Afro-patriarchal knowledge as well. And that is certainly something that informs the concept of family in Yoruba land, for instance, which is not to say that there aren't, there's like feminist approaches, there have always been, toward Afro-patriarchal structures of family. But I think that the Euro-patriarchal concept of family is especially dangerous in that it is so connected to these heteronormative capitalist ideas, which are de facto like ruining the world. In like when you look at nature, we are over consuming, and so much of this consumption culture is actually tied to our idea of the family. This patriarchal idea of which starts from the very early days with the ownership of land, which is something that should not be owned by any one human or group of humans. But the ownership of land, and then how that connects to, the ownership of land is ultimately to secure wealth and goods that have been exploited within a family, which then is defined in a very rigid way, heteronormative way, to involve, a gendered male and female and their offspring, and who then continue to accumulate wealth and so on and so forth. So this is a really contentious idea of family, and we can and should be inspired by, in many indigenous cultures, family is much more fluid. There are family in West African cultures is very gendered, but there is a kind of poetry to the way that you have female spaces and male spaces and androgynous spaces, because in each space the individual is able to access agency and power within that space, and so there's therein a kind of poetic fluid movement. This is something that we can learn a lot from. There is also such a connection between the protection of nature and family in West African metaphysics. There's the family is it's almost the exact opposite of what it is in the Euro-patriarchal tradition, where the consumption and exploitation of nature is interwoven. Where here the veneration, in its own way, a point of criticism, but there's a veneration of natural elements that informs what the family is and the lineages, who is from, your family name could literally be tied to a specific mountain or river that you happen to live nearby. And so there's this huge regard and veneration for that particular natural element, and it must not be exploited and destroyed. So yes, there's definitely a lot that can be unpacked there.
So we are almost at the end, but maybe we have time for a last question, Minna, if you want. Sure.
I can see there's many questions. So
yes,
we can do
everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for great questions.
There are a lot of comments and questions, maybe we can finish connecting about the question of migration, that is also the core issue of this program. And there is a question from Natalie Moran. As you're talking about the normative identity theft and our life becoming a synonym of struggle, how do you see this in art related to migration? Which approach should we have in mind to avoid being dragged into this normative identity centering being white and male, but maybe the core of art and migration? What do you think about?
Yeah, I mean, art plays a fundamental role, obviously, here, partly in documenting. So, there's so many amazing photographers, documentary makers, artists, but also, dancers, singers, poets, who do this work of documenting and giving voice to such a neglected atrocity and oppression in our world. And yeah, I think that is something that we can only utilize more, which is, again, why sensuous knowledge is an approach to knowledge. It's a worldview, and obviously, there's other ways that you could phrase it. But this a worldview that is about synthesizing and interweaving is necessary when it comes to all of the many atrocities this world faces, and perhaps most of all when it comes to migration. Because this is an issue that it has become so entwined in the statistics of it that nobody really connects with on a visceral level. We hear these numbers of people that drown and die and escape and have no food, and all of these situations, and human trafficking of children, of women. And yet, it's bizarre how such news stories can just sort of pass us by. And I think that art really can help to viscerally connect people to these issues. And of course, that's the first step in taking action is actually caring. So art has this ability to make us care, to make us attentive. I think I'll end with that word, attentive. That's a key aim and intention of sensuous, corporeal, embodied knowledge, is that it can really make us attentive, and from there on transform society. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Minna. I think that our time is over, and I would like to thank very much all the people. You were very present and active, and thank you for all the comments and all the questions. And thank you to Piersandra and to Emanuele and to all the staff of Performing Resistance. And moreover, thank you, Minna. It was a brilliant conversation, and I hope to have you very soon in Italy to continue and to think together and to imagine with you.
Thank you, Ilenia. So do I. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks to everyone who came. Thank you.
Bye-bye.